An interesting thing had happened a couple of years ago. I had heard about the potential of weather control. And again, we're talking, actually it's a means being done by electronics. And it was an interesting point, but since I've always been a real stickler as far as what I wanted to speak about or what I would dare talk about, I didn't want to even get into that very far unless I had some real good documentation. And as I said, a couple of years ago, people had sent me bits and pieces that looked like the possibility of that this was real, that weather control was real. But I didn't know much about it, and since I was so totally involved with so many other projects, I didn't zero in on it as a target, so to speak. And then an interesting thing happened. I was going through a book that was published by the United Nations, actually. This UN book was a kind of a list of the treaties that they had accomplished, the different things that the United Nations claimed to be real good moves for themselves, and it was patting themselves on the back type of a publication. As you can see here, this is the publication I'm talking about, and it's actually the titled Basic Facts About the United Nations. And I was going through it and just trying to see some of the ridiculous junk that they've been putting on us behind our backs that they in fact thought was a real good deal. And I noticed that they had an amazing group of treaties, several pages that sort of did a one paragraph synopsis of the treaties that had been signed by the United Nations. And son of a gun, in 1977, I discovered that there was a treaty, as you can see here in this paperwork, there was a treaty that specifically said, they brought all the nations together in 77, now this is 20 years ago, that said that basically now that we can modify, create, and alter the weather, we have to agree that we as nations will not use it as a weapon of war. Now, not only did it say that basically that we now have the ability to do this, so we have to agree not to use it against each other, sort of like chemical, biological agreements, and of course nuclear. And of course, they're all pretty ridiculous agreements because, when we're talking about making agreements with our potential enemies, and yeah, right on, folks, they're not going to use this against us now that they know how to do it, all right? It's just absolutely ludicrous, but nonetheless, they do carry out these exercises in futility on a regular basis. But they also, in this definition of the treaty, it said not only creating a modification of the weather and environment, but the creation of earthquakes and tidal waves, as well as the modification of general weather and environment. Now that's pretty heavy. Now, of course, as when I spoke to senators and congressmen and some other folks that are uneducated, and you bring up the concept of weather control, of course they say, well, that's ridiculous, Mr. Fletcher. And then I had somebody that contacted me and said that only God could change or alter the weather. Well, I wish that were the case, because then I certainly wouldn't worry about it. We would have to also assume that only God can split atoms and create atomic bombs and biological weapons and things that kill us and do electronic mind control, things of that sort. So I wish that was a fact, and unfortunately that's not the case. It was contact the United Nations and to get a specific copy of the treaty that they put together that would prohibit the use of the military use of weather control, creation and generation of earthquakes, etc. And it was interesting because what I did was I called the people at the UN, and I got a hold of a very nice, cooperative little lady on the phone, and I told her what I was looking for. And since at that time I was doing some investigation for a particular congressional office, I told her that I was working, putting together a report that was going to go to the congressional office, and that we needed this particular the text on the treaty to not use weather control as a weapon. So I had the date. It was a specific date in 1977 and the title on it, and she punched it into her computer. Well, she got back to me very quickly in just a moment or two, and she says, "Sir, I don't have anything on weather control and that particular weather modification or that treaty for that year. I don't seem to have that. So without batting an eye, since I did know it was their own publication, so I knew that it was a reality, I said, well, you know, it could be that it's not for general public domain. I said, if you will, since we want to use this as part of a report to the United States Congress, if you don't mind, punch it up, go into it later on, go into your memory banks, the separate computer system that you had. I said, you'll find it, and I reiterated the exact date that the conference took place, and gave her the title once again. She wrote it down, and I gave her my phone number, which at that time I was still in Montana. And a short day, I guess it was maybe 3 days later, I received a phone call from this lady, and it was funny because at that time I was still in the Militia of Montana offices, and I answered the phone, Militia of Montana, and there was a hesitation on the line, and this lady said, well, I'm calling from the United Nations for Mr. Fletcher. I said, well, this is Mr. Fletcher, and she said I knew who she was right away, and of course she said, who did you say you're working with? And I said, well, I happen to be in Montana right now, but we're putting together this report for the Congress. So that made her feel better, and so she therefore said, well, I do have the information you wanted on the conference, the United Nations conference on prohibiting use of weather control. So she sent it on to me, and as a matter of fact, she interestingly asked me, she said, are you going to need the legal, I'm trying to think of the terminology used, the legal certification of that treaty? And I said, certainly, we needed to have the legal certification, not knowing really what that meant, other than, obviously, if they send you the paperwork, it took place, you know, so, so she sent the entire paperwork to me on the convention. She additionally sent to me in both French and English from the legal department of the United Nations the actual legal certification of the date, time, etc. on it. So what we have here, according to the Senate and Congress and other people, are folks that will look you straight in the face and say, well, the idea of weather control, creation of earthquakes electronically and all of that's absolutely ridiculous, Mr. Fletcher, or anyone else that might ask it. However, we find out that our nation 20 years ago actually went into an entire convention that said, now that we can do it, we promise that we won't use it against other countries. Well, unfortunately, that promise does not include using it against ourselves here in the United States. So, again, when Senator Cole had asked me what it was that I meant, inferring that the New World Order persons will utilize it as a weapon against us, that was what I meant. And I pursued a little farther beyond the basic, the information on the convention. And a friend of mine said, well, you know, there's patents on that equipment. And as you can see here, he's absolutely right. These are the papers, the paperwork of the actual patents done on the electronic means by which electronic waves or rays, if you will, can be utilized to block, stop, move, alter, change, completely block off and divert or whatever the weather. It includes creating lows, creating storms, expanding them, generating, and even generating ELF, low frequency vibrations that actually can move Earth in the ground itself and possibly generate or slide and expand the possibility of earthquakes. So this is actually the patents on that equipment. So all of this is based on the brilliant discoveries of Nikola Tesla, who was a man that 75 years ago, actually the fellow that tapped into, created, or if you will, discovered the application of alternating current, the AC current that we use when you throw on your light at the house. It is a Nikola Tesla discovery, if you will, or by which to channel that and use it. This fellow was apparently an amazing person. If you want to find out more about it, at the end of this video I'll give you information to where you can find out extensive information relative to Nikola Tesla. But the very equipment that's being used presently, covertly, secretly, a multitude of outrageous experiments and programs right now. The application of magnetics, electronics, electronic waves, and what have you, is all come off of the original Tesla experiments. Nikola Tesla, I guess one of the most upsetting applications of it now is even mind control, which I will briefly get into towards the end of this tape. But it's the electronics application to alter people's personalities, even do it from a distance, as in just aiming an instrument at somebody and causing depression and a variety of other mental disorders or personality traits. Let me get farther into what took place. After receiving and finding, getting our hands on the actual patents for the equipment for weather control, I expanded my own circle of contacts and with people out of Washington, D.C., and I asked some of my friends in the Congress and the Senate and a few other areas up there, what is the story with this? This is mind-boggling. And I said, here we got people on the left hand who tell us we're crazy to even talk about it, and then I find that we have patents, etc., on the equipment, and I put out feelers all over the country, and I started receiving a variety of information. An amazing point was sent to me by a friend of mine, and that was that Senator Claiborne Pell, who's a high-ranking member of the the Senate Intelligence Committee for many years, has been in the Senate for many, many years, some 20 years ago had written this story that you see right now on the screen. Well, the senator wrote a story relative to what I'm talking about, and that is application of electronic weather control as a weapon. He points out in his own story, in his own words, very specifically, again, remember this is 20 years ago, that we now can create tidal waves, create earthquakes, and create and maintain and alter other weather areas, whether it's a storm, expanding storms, or whatever. As you can see here in this particular story. Right now, now we have a high-ranking member of the Senate Relations Committee, Foreign Relations and Intelligence Committee, and he's talking about the use of weather control as a weapon. He also pointed out that, in fact, we had already used it, and it had worked well in flooding torrentially Cambodia, Laos, and during the Vietnam War. We used it as flooding as an application to flood the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it worked very good. We bogged them down there, and then we were able to come in on top of that, of course, and bomb them, etc. So we used it as a weapon of war ourselves during the Vietnam War. Well, other folks contacted me and said, one gentleman wrote me, I think it was from California, and said, Bob, there is actually paperwork, an ongoing standard form in the United States government that's called an initial report on weather modification activities. This is a form that you fill out when you're planning to go out and screw up the weather. This is a government form, as you can see it right here, and you can clearly read what we're talking about here, right? This is an initial report on the weather modification activities, and this is done under the Department, at that time anyhow, the Department of Commerce. And by the way, this is only 10 years ago. This is 1986 when this particular form was lifted and sent to myself. So here we go again. You have the Senate, the Congress, and these characters telling us that we're crazy, and they have regular government forms that we're going to fill out prior to creating an earthquake and destroying half of California, or whatever their plan for the day was. Now, I found out that a few years ago, as a matter of fact, what I want to do now is I'm going to go through a chronology of events that has led up to what we have now, which is a very sophisticated means of electronic generation of storms. If you will follow this along, and we'll point out the highlights for you relative to actually a chronology of what's taken place. As far back as I mentioned to you, in 1977, they of course had done the convention. I want to trip through a handful of amazing points for you. In September of 1989, in the Washington Post, they ran a story. Now this is 89. They ran a story, and it was a coverage of a high-level meeting that took place in Tokyo on global environment. The speech by the president of the World Bank was rather amazing. It was Barbara Conable, C-O-N-A-B-L, made this statement. She said, while higher global temperatures may cause a number of disasters, they may also warm the colder, unproductive areas of the north of the globe and move those areas into a more productive status. Now, this statement was coordinated with the fact that the New World elite had already been warming the atmosphere in the most northern areas of the globe. And that was in 1989, after at least 20 years of global experiments with warming the atmosphere, shooting electronic rays, if you will, into the ionosphere and altering the temperature, etc. So when we get talking and these people are synthetically warning us about stupid things like you use too much deodorant with hairspray or something like that in the morning and you're going to end up warming the globe, they need to stop fooling around electronically with the ionosphere, because that's where the serious global warming is coming from. They've set up 2 months later, in November 1989, a list of specialty GWEN towers, this is ground wave emergency network towers, was put together by a group of scientists, and I was able to receive those while we were up there in Montana. And we have here, as a matter of fact, just very briefly, I'm going to show you this. This is a locations of many, not all of them, but many of the GWEN towers that can cooperatively function as transmission towers or transmission points to assist in altering the weather. The GWEN towers, of course, are being told, we're being told that this is a ground wave emergency network system, that if in fact there's an atomic attack, for example, that this system will function and they'll still be able to communicate. Well, I've looked at many good photographs of Hiroshima, and I have some kind of a gut feeling that the GWEN tower system will not be working very well if in fact we have a nuclear attack in the United States. So I believe that may possibly be obviously another one of their smoke screens. Now these systems, as a matter of fact, would be knocked out, according to scientific experts, by strictly the electromagnetic impulse immediately behind any kind of a nuclear blast. It will totally wipe out, not only if there's anything still standing, which of course is very questionable, but it would, by the electronic impulse alone, it's just going to do a total wipeout of anything that potentially would be of an electrical communication device. So it's almost ludicrous that they're pulling this on us and telling us that that's what this is for. All right? Now, interestingly enough, back in the 93 floods, in 1993, in the Midwest, when after these GWEN towers were put up, some of the very center points where they had done some of the very first GWEN tower constructions was where we had the unbelievable 1993 floods that totally wiped out huge areas of the United States and the farm areas. Now, the system they used is similar to what the Russians had done, which was called the woodpecker system. The woodpecker system, it actually got its name because when people would hear the system turned on, what the Russians were using over here, actually, if you will, as a weapon against ourselves, it made the sound, the rapping noise, electronically like that of a woodpecker, so it got the slang term hung on it as called the woodpecker system. And what it does is alters the magnetic fields in localized areas. And by doing that, it actually stalls or blocks off weather fronts. So if you have a system running through a country, across the country in a given direction, by putting up this electronic alteration of the magnetic fields, it actually can stop it off and either have humidity, for example, back up and drop to an extensive amount of rain in an area, or channel it off so that it'll curve and go off into an opposite direction, and which obviously by doing that, for one thing, you can create droughts. As you can see here, droughts, not only in the United States of America and in foreign countries, are unbelievably devastating. We presently, for example, have obviously the real terrible weather. A few of the locations of these towers were announced out directly, and I will give a few of those. It's Mechanicsville, Iowa, Ledyard, Iowa, Chelsea, Wisconsin, Shepherd, Minnesota, Curryville and Dudleyville, Missouri, Whitney, Nebraska, and several locations in Montana and Colorado, where the Gwen towers are profusely set up and can function well in conjunction with the huge facility that's in the Alaska area. It was formally announced that the ice cap regions in the Arctic had begun a serious melting around 1976 and 77. Well, now, that's real curious, because this was not only the time when the Russians had started their first weather control modifications and electronic alterations of the atmosphere and weather controls, but it was the same year. 1977 was the year of the United Nations first convention for the prohibition of the use of these controls for military use. The Washington Post, January the 28th, 1990, ran a story by a British scientist that had discovered this major event. 15% of the entire ice cap had melted in a period of 10 years. That's an amazing 115,000 square miles of ice had melted all of a sudden. And again, it corresponds directly to the period of time when the Russians had started shooting their own, forgetting our disgusting under-the-table operations. The Russians had already started profusely bombarding us with their weather control equipment. What this does, and I'll get a little more into the technicality part of it later on, but basically it's a heating device. In 1990, in June, the magazine titled Progressive Magazine did a large expose report on the Gwen towers, explaining that the towers have as many as 100 copper wires fanning out from the base of the towers underground. And they test the Gwen tower transmissions every hour of every day. Now, a frightening effect of such electromagnetic transmission tests would be the effects of electromagnetic radiation of people and the animals that are close by, which is another whole separate concept introduced by the top secret programs of MK Ultra, which was the electronic mind control and operations of scientific experiments carried out for years by our own secret government in the United States, in hospitals, unsuspecting civilians, military personnel, and this electromagnetic application to actually alter, change, and make people crazy in some cases was done profusely, secretly by MK Ultra. Although the frequencies of the Gwen system is slightly different from that of the Russians' weather control, as the system is allowed to grow, the New World Order will be able to fine-tune this thing. As I mentioned before the Senate, they will be able to fine-tune their variety of electronic equipment and be able to totally control, simply at will, the weather in the world. Now, in Russia, this is mind-boggling when I found this out, and it's supported totally by standard media, if you will, which surprised me as well, because as it stands now, the media doesn't want to get into any of this very much. But in Russia, for several years, they've actually been renting, leasing, and selling weather control by electronic equipment to the farmers in Russia to control small areas over their own farms. Now,